Hi, welcome to another episode of The State and You. Today I have Cynthia Cartier as my guest. Cindy is the first selectman in Guilford.
Selectman.
one of five. And what we thought today we talk a little bit about is sort of contrast Hartford and municipalities. As people know, I represent North Branford, but I also represent North Guilford, which is a town in which you've served on the
Right.
Board of Selectmen for a number of terms.
Right.
And
7 years.
7 years,
Yeah.
okay. And then also the Board of Education, I guess, prior to that.
Correct.
And what I thought we could talk about a little bit is first maybe where the state budget is and the impact it does have on municipalities and how you've dealt with some of the decisions that the state of Connecticut has had to make, really over the last 6 years. Pretty much almost for my entire term that I've served up there, things went sour pretty quickly. And I think every budget that we've had to put together, we've always been looking at deficits. And I think it's no different going into this next budget cycle. Whoever the victor is in the governor's race, I think is going to have their hands full. We're facing a projected $2.5 billion deficit. I think as residents know, in the last cycle, the state had raised taxes of over $1.5 billion a year to try to close that gap in hopes that it would close all the future deficits that were projected and that we might have some surpluses. And unfortunately, the economy in Connecticut has just stalled out, and the spending, in my opinion, has just increased at too great of a rate. And lo and behold, after all those tax increases, we're staring at another hole. And I think one of our challenges up in Hartford certainly is trying to avoid cutting municipalities. And I think over the last few years, we've pretty much flat funded the towns.
Well, that's true, except you raise costs in so many other areas that they're sort of what we refer to as backdoor taxes. So you've raised costs on licensing, on different fees to do with the state, costs to send police officers to the academy. You tacked on a tax to do that. So where you didn't necessarily alter the money's coming percentage-wise, which we get very little anyway, what happened is you raise the fees in other areas, which then increase the cost for us to do business with the state, essentially. And that's sort of been the challenge. But what I find interesting, Vin, is that I want to know who's doing the state's revenue projections, because, both of us are in business. I own several small businesses, you own a business, and, you base your projections, your revenue projections, on either the industry, the business itself, you do comparables, et cetera. And, for them to say, well, they'll never use this phrase, but basically they underestimated the revenues and then they want to blame the economy. In Guilford, we also have to do revenue projections, and we've always taken more of a conservative approach and anticipated some of the challenges so that we've been able to ensure that not only do we have the resources we need, but that we're not undercutting ourselves.
Right.
So what?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I
need a new person up there.
in Hartford's approach, I think we sort of saw a pie-in-the-sky approach.
Yeah.
There was a lot of criticism over the revenue projections, the income, in terms of income.
Right.
People felt that the income tax projections were a little bit too rich.
Right.
And sure enough, we didn't see the money that we thought would come in. So you're definitely right on that. I think that those projections certainly were off. But I really think that people didn't anticipate how long the economic recession would lag.
Right.
And frankly, I think, I was very critical of a lot of these policies. I think some of those tax increases really helped stall out our economy and sort of drag it along a little bit more. One of the challenges, I think, for municipalities, we shifted a lot of that revenue that we gave to you, which was more of a just sort of a piece of the revenue stream. So a town would get part of the casino money.
Right.
And that was all converted to now bond funds.
Right.
So the towns are getting all of their grants in the form of bonding revenue. So it's sort of, I think, from that perspective, it's made it a little bit stiffer. There's not a lot of flexibility in what municipalities can do. And I know, like here in North Branford, it's been tough to keep taxes stable.
Right.
And I know in Guilford you've worked with Joe Mazza, who's the first selectman, and you all have been able to sort of increase the fund balance
Yes.
in that town, which I think Connecticut certainly needs to work on. We have depleted our rainy day fund,
Right.
And really have never been able to recover. So what were some of the things that the towns did?
Right. Well, I think one of the things we did is we took over sort of the majority 4.5 years ago, and like I said, I've been on for 7 years. So when I first went on, having been on other boards, but knowing this about government, we don't do any long-range planning. And that's certainly not happening at the state, and it wasn't happening in Guilford. So when we took over about 4.5 years ago, Joe, myself, and Selectman Haverda sat down and said we got to have some long-range planning. So we put in place a 5-year capital plan. So we know, what we're looking at for operating expenses for capital and what we bond out. And you really don't want to bond anything that has a life use of less than 10 years. Because then you're not recouping your investment, so to speak. But what we did is we have a whole capital plan, and that continues to roll. So as the year 1 rolls off, year 6 adds on, and we have that in place. We also did a couple year out operating budget expenses, looking at what is the conservative revenue we're expecting, knowing that things are being impacted and fluctuate. And we're able to do that, not over anticipating additional revenue that's not going to be there, and knowing that the state was facing some of the challenges they are, we actually underestimated some of the revenue that we would get from the state because we were anticipating potentially the cut that first year.
So when the town of Guilford does their budget in the current year, they actually project out a couple of years after that as well? Oh,
so
wow.
what we were facing, we came in as 5 to 7% increases, and we've been able to take those down to the rate of inflation, to around 2%, which I think, of course, everybody wants 0, and we're working towards that. But we needed to sort of clean up years prior of sort of financial mismanagement, if you lack of a better way to describe it, and also putting into place to recoup our capital, like meaning taking care of our buildings, taking care of our vehicles and sort of the infrastructure that had been completely abandoned, so to speak, that that we weren't paying attention to, and we didn't have the resources of the plan to do. So now we're on a really good stride and a good plan to make sure that we have everything in place with, as I said, the capital plan and looking at operating. So we kind of can see what our budgets are going to be in the next couple of years, which gives people reassurance. And on top of that, our rainy day account was getting close to $1 million, which is your savings account. To have a town of an $80 million budget with $1 million in a savings account is ludicrous, right? So bond rating agencies want to see you having at least a 5 to 10% of what your overall budget is in your rainy day account. So now we've increased it so it's over $5 million. The rating agencies are happier. It gives us more ability to borrow and more ability to borrow at a better rate. So those are really important things that sort of behind the scenes from a financial perspective that are important when you put together sort of this budgeting for any organization. Right.
Hartford, we do a similar projection. I didn't realize that towns could project out, 2 or 3 years out. Right. It's probably, it's very intriguing and something that probably North Branford would want to take a look at too, because you want to see the path that you're going down the road.
Right.
And to be able to project out a couple of years of budgets probably would help to help to make better decision making, I'm sure.
Right. And of course, everybody wants more revenue to come from sort of the commercial side of things, and but at the same time, you want growth to happen appropriately, and that's another thing we're working on in Guilford. We finally have the infamous rock pile up and running, so they're working on getting that construction up, which will help a lot towards what we're trying to do. But I think that what we're facing at the state level, which is impacting all of us locally, is the fiscal piece. And it's interesting because our predecessors wanted to blame the economy in Guilford. I'm like, no, the economy really hasn't impacted the local, because our property taxes have remained. The majority of our income comes from property taxes, and that hasn't really been impacted based upon the economy. Because that's all. It's set for 5 years until you do a reval.
Right.
So. Anyway, once you start looking at the expense side, which is what you mentioned earlier, that's what you have to start looking at. You have to start looking at your expenses and what's needed. So I feel like at the state, not only have you done a poor job, with this governor and this leadership, done a terrible job in terms of projecting out the revenue side and doing what needs to be done. And I know you're fighting this, Vin, but the spending, it's like they just.
Yeah, our approach, we always looked at it, it's a three-legged stool, is what we said. You need to look at spending, you need to look at revenue, and you need to look at borrowing. And year after year, we have put too much emphasis on the revenue, too much emphasis on the borrowing, and not enough on the spending. side, we have increased borrowing by $1 billion per year in the past 2 years. And while we're not going to feel the impact of that right away because you're not paying all that debt service,
Right.
if you ratchet up borrowing $1 billion a year, well, after 10 years, that's $10 billion more of debt service payments. And you can't turn that back around, and that's when you really feel it, is down the road. So, certainly I've been critical of that, trying to bring it to people's attention, because some of the stuff that we do, you talk about transparency. I think on the local level, when I served, there is much more transparency. You can't go to the grocery store or go shopping without somebody talking to you about an issue. And so you're really more accountable.
Yes.
And I think that it was important. It was a great tool for me when I went up to Hartford of having that local base to start out with. And it's just interesting watching up in Hartford now, the budgeting process. You could sort of pick out the officials that have had a local background versus the ones that didn't and just ran for office at the state level to start out. There's more of an appreciation for the impact we have on municipalities. And I think there's an overall philosophy, regardless of party, that we truly believe the towns do a better job spending the money and budgeting than the state of Connecticut.
And oftentimes providing the requisite services, depending upon what it is. I think, a lot of emphasis obviously now is on the economy, as it should be, and sort of the business side of things with the state. And I think, you need people up there who get and have an appreciation and understanding how to run organizations, whether it's profit, nonprofit, but most particularly a municipality gives you that skill set. But the other thing about being involved in the local community, and I think, where you've been an asset to the towns, having served locally, but also being involved in local organizations. It's the fabric of the community. So when issues come up, like, for example, you helped to get the bonding for the VFW in Guilford.
Right.
And I know Pat Widlitz was instrumental in that as well. But because she understood the organization, because you understood the organization, you were involved, it made you have a greater appreciation for what's going on locally. And I think when somebody looks to serve at a state level, you're serving the community first.
Right.
And you really need to understand the fabric and what's needed in the community. I currently serve on the board of SARA, and our intellectually disabled community has gone through a lot of changes over the last 30 years in particular, in the sense that, what was once regarded as an intellectual disability is now expanded to include multiple fashions. You're talking about children on the autism spectrum, behavioral. I mean, what we provide service for is far-reaching and far-encompassing. Mm-hmm. But if I had a child with a disability in that regard, I'd want an organization like SARA to provide that service. So I know the question I have for you is, I know one of the challenges at the state level is getting the state to shift priority from DSS and handling these things to shifting it to these organizations that do a tremendous job. And they have in the Birth to 3 program. But I'm just saying these are areas where the state could actually still provide the service, which is needed, but actually save dollars at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's a discussion that we've had up in Hartford, is taking those state services that are provided by state agencies at times that are much more expensive, and shifting it to the private providers, to SARA, to BH Care. Yep. They could make the money go a lot further, but they're in the communities.
Well, it's even, they're better.
They're much more effective at getting the job done. So it is beginning. It's a slower pace than I would like, but we are starting to see a shift. And I think what we have to be careful of at the same time is making sure in some areas that when you're shifting over to the private providers, that the accountability is still there.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, when people have asked me this, I'm sure they ask you, what's the role of government, right? That's a lot of conversation we're having. And my response has always been, the government has to take care of infrastructure. I mean, that goes local all the way to the state. You have state roads and federal, but infrastructure even within your buildings and things like that in the local community, making sure we're safe, again, local all the way to the federal level, and educating our kids. So that responsibility falls on all different facets of the government spectrum. Again, working on it and getting it on a local level makes you understand the process as you may fold into other areas like you've done. And I think, there are a lot of the state representatives like yourself and state senators have told me, and you and I've had this discussion, that you're working intimately with your local leadership on what the needs are of that community as you're trying to do your job up in Hartford, because they're not separate and apart. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, and I think more and more it certainly has become a challenge, and nothing is sacred anymore, with the budget process, because it is so difficult. And this next cycle is probably going to be even more difficult than we could ever imagine, facing such a big deficit. One of the things that getting back to revenue and the volatility of it, is something we really need to get our hands around. Municipalities, the grand lists, there's some shifting, back and forth, but I think the benefits of the way that local is set up, that money goes directly to the towns. The state can't get their hands on it, which is a good thing. But also there isn't the volatility that we do see in Hartford with the stock market. And it's something that we need to wrap our arms around. I've put in some proposals to try to address the issue. And actually it's starting to become a national conversation that we're going to be talking about actually with NCLS, and a national organization. We'll be taking up that discussion actually at the end of the month. One of the other things that I thought was sort of a shining star, I think, for Guilford to talk about, is with all of our towns struggling financially for years and years and years. I think well before I represented Guilford, I used to always hear about, how Guilford needed a new high school.
Yes.
And finally, about a year and a half ago, I guess we broke ground, and we're seeing the brick and mortar now starting to go up. And on a local level, North Branford operates very differently. In our town, the school construction gets approved by the council, and then that's it. It goes to bonding, and it gets done in cooperative with the Board of Education. Guilford's a little bit different. You have the referendum process, and how does that work? And
well, I think as you know, this was a really community effort, and there had to be community buy-in, because this is the biggest expenditure Guilford's made in its town history with the new high school. And so we've having served in the Board of Ed, facilities was a focus when I was there, and again we put a plan in place to take care of our buildings and prioritize needs. And the high school is sort of always in the background, like at some point we have to do this, but what do we have to do and when do we bring it up? So we really focused on taking care of the other buildings. I progressed to the Board of Selectmen, still sort of having a connection to the Board of Ed and sort of being the liaison. What the process we put in place is, instead of one person or a group of people deciding we need a high school and that's it, we put together a task force, and the task force encompassed a representative from the Board of Selectmen, myself, someone for the Board of Finance, people from the Board of Ed, and folks from the community, realtors, developers, engineers, architects, financial folks from the community, accountants, but also from different organizations in the community, sort of sports and music, and that would be impacted by the high school in a multitude of different ways. So this committee got together, it was a little over 20 of us, and the way it was looked at is like, we're going to look at all possibilities with the high school. We know something needs to be done. At a minimum, we have to fix it. We have to repair things that need to be repaired, going beyond just basically putting a Band-Aid on things. So we looked at things like, what do we do if we just sort of maintain and improve things that need to be improved, building codes, those sort of things. We looked at, we projected out the cost for all of this over 20 years. We looked at just renovate it, like a basic renovation, Then we looked at renovate like new, and then we looked at a potentially of a new high school. So after we retained a firm to provide all of this, and we spent well over 3 months, week after week meeting, constant emails going back and forth, information being disseminated to really question and challenge all of this. Interestingly, there's a gentleman on Superintendent Fusco, who used to be the superintendent in Branford, who was very much anti a new high school when he started this process. And that's what I mean. There people came to this task force from all different perspectives. Myself, I just wanted to make sure that whatever we were doing was the most efficient for both from a financial perspective, but also for the teaching process. So, make a long story short, as we went through the process, we discovered that the most cost-effective way was a new high school. Because when you think about what you get back from the state in construction, we knew the exact dollars it would be when we build it. When you renovate, like you don't always know what you're getting. Also, from a curriculum perspective is important, but just purely from the cost effective, when you looked at what the cost would be versus renovating like new, there wasn't a lot of disparity between renovate like new and a new high school, and even the renovations, the numbers were close, and it made the most sense to say we should be building a new high school. Also knowing that when the high school was originally built back in the late 50s, it was not planned that this would be the be-all end-all. It was sort of put up because I guess from what I understand, the Quinnipiac, the bridge was developed overnight, and there sort of became an influx of population. They needed to do something quickly. So it was never planned that this building would last beyond 20 years, and here we are 50 years later. But nonetheless, so we did all that. After we decided that this is our recommendation, it had to go to all the boards for approval, all the elected officials. And we needed, a lot of hearings went on at that point, and then we needed to sell it to the community, because at that point, getting back to sort of the process, is after the elected officials approve it, Board of Ed approves it first, then it goes to Board of Selectmen, and then it goes to the Board of Finance. Then, because it's over $1 million, it goes out to the community for a referendum. So we wanted the community buy-in. Right. So what we did is we put together a communication committee, basically, to go out and talk to all different groups in the community. There was a tremendous group of parents that had been formed prior, for a little while before this, that had formed themselves to look at possibilities for the high school, knowing that this was something coming. And they really helped to advocate the new high school. So they sort of worked separate but in conjunction with what we were trying to do. But it was really the parents in the community, then, and the leaders that really brought it to the public and said, we need you to support this, but these are the reasons why. You know, most people, it was an economic issue because it was going to impact people, a minimum about $500 a year per household, depending on the value of your home. So we needed to have the buy-in, and people need to understand why this is important, beyond just aesthetics of saying, I want a new school. You know, it went beyond that. So we were able to, spending a lot of time reaching out to the community. I myself met with a number of different groups, stood in front of bishops to talk to people. I mean, we did all this kind of stuff. And ultimately it passed with a very strong numbers. It was 2-1, and people were very supportive of the proposal and what's being done. And it's, I have to say, the building committee that we subsequently put in place have been outstanding. Again, these are all volunteers, all residents from the community. Amazing. Yeah,
it's funny because you talk about task force, and we've done similar initiatives like that in North Branford. When we renovated our libraries, there was a task force put together, similar with our school, and now faced with our Route 80 reconstruction, the old baseball field that was over there, and our old community center. We're looking to figure out what to do with that property, and so they've had some meetings and got all the special interest groups together to talk about it. When you hear task force in Hartford, sometimes people roll their eyes because when you get to Hartford, the task forces have a different connotation. But I think it's important, to get everybody to have buy-in. Yeah. Sometimes with the legislature, if we don't like a concept, but there are individuals that continue to push it, you sort of bury it by turning it into a study or a task force and let somebody, mull it around. But at times there are good reasons to form them. One of them that Representative Widlitz actually had really pushed and championed is one to study all of our taxes, tax incident study, to really try to understand, Connecticut's tax structure. And I think it's funny. I keep bringing ourselves back to revenue, but I serve on the finance committee too. But you really have to unpeel that onion in order, before you can move forward, I think. So I think the good thing about the high school is, you're getting something that everybody had a little part of. And it's going to really provide, obviously, important tools for the schools.
Well, I think there's also such a challenge in our society right now on the role of politicians / public servants. I grew up where I said I want to be a public servant. I didn't think about it being a politician, or to me, I want to be a public servant. I want to serve the community in different ways. Hope maybe an elected office, whatever. But the one thing over my almost 2 decades of being involved in sort of local communities and indirectly working with the state, is that it's important to your leaders. It's not about what they want, Vin. And I always say this to people. It's not about what Cindy Cartier wants for Guilford. It's about what the people of Guilford want, what the people of Branford want, what the people of North Branford want. Right. What is good for the community as a whole? And your best leaders are the ones that can sort of look at things, you know, from the view of everybody and do what's best for the good of the community as a whole.
And help facilitate it.
And having the experience, you know, working and being a community leader and being a public servant and in the position where you're tasked with making decisions and leading people's lives in these things. And not that it's not important to work on community initiatives, because it's very important. It's all part of the process. But also serving sort of in the public arena as well, where you're sort of charged now, you've got the official responsibility of making these decisions, teaches you a lot. And one of the things I love doing is getting people to serve on official commissions or committees in town, and they all criticize things, right? And then we get them on a committee or commission, they're like, wait a minute, I have to listen to all these people, wait, this is how it works. And so the people that have the experience of doing that, and literally, like I said, being charged with the responsibility of managing the lives, the resources, community affairs in that regard, are the best leaders ultimately as you go up sort of the chain. And you could see that historically. You know, when I think about Abraham Lincoln, you know, he didn't just wake up one day and become president. I mean, he worked his way from local to state to, you know, not that you have, you know, not, you know, but it made him a great leader. It's what you learn along the way, you know. And
it's sort of, I think one of the aspects that I've liked, you know, local offices like this, it is a part-time office.
Right.
And so you're still working in the community, raising your kids in the community, and you're connected in that way. In Hartford, it's similar. It's really what we call a citizen legislature.
Right.
We aren't full-time, so we all have jobs. Yeah. We do other things in our private life, and you bring that perspective to Hartford. And so, you know, oftentimes I find, you know, I draw from that. I'll draw from the conversations I have with my wife about the kids in school, and you bring that up to Hartford sometimes, and you really can't take anything for granted, because you just never know what people know or don't know.
Yeah.
But having all of those experiences and allowing you to share that with the people, I think it makes you more effective.
Well, somebody said to me the other day, Vin, I was talking to somebody about, you know, different issues going on in the community, and they said to me, you know, Sin, one of the things that has made you an effective leader over time, you know, and I would not have said this, you know, 16 years ago when you came to Guilford, because you were younger, and, you know, I started getting involved in the planning and zoning and, you know, sort of doing things locally. But they said, you know, when I look at you now and I watch you serve on boards and serve in the different roles and subcommittees and such, you really truly bring your life experiences to the table.
Well, I think
to look at things, and it's exactly what you're saying.
And that's your Italian background too.
Yeah, well, of course.
You tell stories.
100% of Italian.
Right.
It's true.
So how does it look for Guilford in the future? You know, with the future budget coming up, you know, obviously we're always cautious about what we're going to get from the state.
Well, I think that the two concerns we have are, you know, knowing that we don't get a lot from the state, and on one hand is good, you know, but we still do get resources from the state. So every little bit helps, and a deficit of that would impact us, obviously. So our concern is that going to change coming up in the next, you know, legislature, knowing that you have to now fill another budget deficit? How's that going to happen, and what's the impact going to be? Of course, the municipalities are going to fight for that same funding. Right. The second piece is, okay, if you don't reduce the funding, what else are you going to tax us with, so to speak, like last time? So there's a double concern, and, you know, that also makes it more difficult for us to, you know, project out and do the things we talked about, but, you know, we'll do the best we can. So we're hoping that things can stay as best as possible, but if changes happen, that we can do it together as a community to figure out what would be right for each respective town and community. And that's what you need to bring to the table in representing us. It's
one of the tough jobs with the towns, because you budget, you know, you start budgeting now through January. The state hasn't even started yet. We finish up in June. So you guys finish first.
Right.
We should be the ones going first. So it is tough.
You're right.
But I want to thank you for coming on the show and
talking
a little bit about Guilford and the how that process works there. And I look forward to continue working with you on the state and local level.
Thanks, Vin.
Thanks.